Welcome to the Industry Wants webinar on the state of purchasing practices in the garment and footwear sector. We're really delighted to see so many of you joining us today from across the world, and we hope to inform you and activate you towards a journey of responsible purchasing practices. I'm Karen Diaz. I'm the project manager of the Industry We Want and also your host and presenter for today. So we have around 60 minutes scheduled for our session. I'll start you off with a brief reintroduction to the Industry We Want and our industry dashboard, and then I'll be handing it over to Leonie Abraham from the Better Buying Institute for a deeper look at the Partnership Index and its survey, which powers our purchasing practice metric. We will then move on to the Industry Wants purchasing practice metric and share highlights from the first cycle results, including a review of the findings in the ethical trading initiatives and the Fair Wear member scores, which was also generated by the Partnership Index. And we will then close off at least the content part of our session with a few words from Milena Gropp on what we see as responsible purchasing practices and a spotlight on a complementary multi-stakeholder driven initiative, namely the Common Framework on Responsible Purchasing Practices. And then after that, I will invite Leonie, Milena, and Lindsay Wright, the communication manager at Better Buying, onto the screen for a live Q&A with all of you. And hopefully we'll have enough time for that at the end. So please feel free to use the chat Q&A function of this webinar throughout the session. Do not put it in the chat. You will be reminded to please move your questions into the Q&A function. And if there are not too many questions, we might finish early, but considering how much we have to share with you today, that might not be the case. So now a quick reminder to those of you that might not have been part of these webinars before. The Industry We Want was initiated by ETI, the Ethical Trading Initiative, and Fair Wear to accelerate progress on social, commercial, and environmental issues in the garment and footwear sector. So we were really pleased to be joined in our endeavors this year by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, who will be leading more on the environmental pillar. And we've benefited hugely from the partnership of many industry experts and widespread industry consultation and input, including from who are now our data partners, Wage Indicator, Better Buying, the Apparel Impact Institute, who also works with the World Resource Center, but more on that when I look at our focus areas. So just briefly, a shared vision of the Industry We Want is a garment and footwear industry that realizes its full potential to ensure dignity of workers in decent jobs, thriving businesses along the supply chain, and a positive impact on the planet. And as indicated in this vision statement, we have three pillars or levers of change: the social, the commercial, and the environmental. And within each of these pillars, we have determined our key focus areas. And this was done in really widespread consultation last year with affected stakeholders and industry experts. So in the social pillar, our focus area is wages, specifically the gap between minimum wages and living wages in key garment producing countries. For the commercial pillar, which is the subject of our discussion today, our focus area is purchasing practices, namely, how do we leverage supplier feedback to drive positive developments in commercial relationships in this industry, which are critical for the realization of both social and environmental goals. And in the environmental pillar, our focus area is greenhouse gas emissions and the reductions of these in line with net zero targets. Now, with these focus areas in mind, we actually launched the first iteration of our industry dashboard. 3 annual metrics, one on wages, one on purchasing practices, and one on greenhouse gas emissions that have established a baseline measurement, a benchmark for us. Now, data for each of these metrics will be updated on an annual basis until at least 2025, so that we can really gauge how the industry is progressing, but also ask the bigger, more difficult questions about how to support, stimulate, and scale progress, which is something that we haven't really been able to do. Really looking at how do we transform this industry. but today's session will focus exclusively on purchasing practices. Now, as many of us know in the Zoom room, unfair purchasing practices are structural in global garment supply chains, but are also deeply interlinked with the current functioning of the sector, which is unfortunately known for its vastly unequal power relations between different actors. Indeed, COVID has also amplified the flaws of the system, which resulted in, or actually maintained, existing poor purchasing practices, and resulted in high costs being imposed on manufacturers, not only in the EU, but in production countries as well. Now, we see brands as playing a key role in advancing or curtailing responsible purchasing practices. Namely, there is significant evidence from partners like Better Buying that show that companies' own purchasing practices can limit and undermine the ability of suppliers to achieve brands' public commitments to human rights standards, and that some of these behaviors even end up actively contributing to human rights issues. And public consideration for the impact of brands' purchasing practices is only getting stronger. And we see this from the increased attention from affected stakeholders, but also, and more importantly, from legislators across the globe. So when it comes to the topic of purchasing practices, we've decided to focus on two issues within our industry we want to tackle: the lack of data on the state of purchasing practices in the industry, which is what we're doing with this metric and in collaboration with Better Buying. But also there is a lack of consensus on collective vision on what good purchasing practices look like. And that is where we have closely connected to the MSI group and their work on the Common Framework of Responsible Purchasing Practices, but more on that from Milena. Now, to kick off our deep dive on the Partnership Index, I will now be handing it over to Leonie Abraham, Vice President for Business Development at the Better Buying Institute.
Thanks, Karen, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And also, I want to say thanks to everyone who took part in this survey last year, the brands and retailers who invited their suppliers to rate them, and also the suppliers who took their time to complete the questionnaire. We got off to a great start. We generated some first metrics around the industry's purchasing practices, and we now have a strong starting point from which we can track progress on purchasing practices going forward. And as we move into the next phase, we really want to build on last year's momentum. So the information we collect this year will show the current state of purchasing practices worldwide and how they've changed over the last 12 months. We're going to be using the Better Buying Partnership Index again to survey suppliers about their relationships with their brand partners. So what their customers are doing well and where they need to improve. The survey is completely anonymous for suppliers to complete, and feedback will be used to calculate the Industry We Want's purchasing practices score for 2022. Now, the rating cycle will run for about a month, starting from the 3rd of October. And as I said, we really want to gather as much feedback from suppliers as we can. The more data we collect, the more robust the purchasing practices score that we produce for the Industry We Want. On the next slide, I'm going to go into more detail about the Better Buying Partnership Index. This is a short and accessible survey that collects feedback from suppliers about their purchasing practices of their customers through just 14 questions. It's quick and easy for suppliers to complete. It takes around 5 minutes to rate each of their customers. The survey assesses the quality of buyer-supplier relationships. It looks at specific practices that have a direct impact on supplier operations and their ability to provide decent working conditions, to pay living wages, and to make a reasonable profit. The survey can also help to identify potential problem areas in the relationship. It enables us to obtain feedback at scale, since multiple people at a supplier company can rate each of their customers, and suppliers can also feed back on each of their brand partners. So we really can collect a lot of information. The survey can also be used across multiple tiers of the supply chain, and all of the ratings received will be aggregated into the purchasing practices scores for the industry we want, as well as separate scores for ETI and Fairware based on feedback on their member brands. So how does the survey process work? On the next slide, I've just shown quickly how it does work. So Better Buying creates a link to the survey, which, as I've said already, will go live on October the 3rd. We're planning a publicity push to share the link with you and to let you all know when it's live. And we're asking you to share it with your suppliers and to ask them to participate. Once suppliers have completed the survey, the results are rolled up into the purchasing practices score, and this will give us some insight into how it's changed from last year and whether or not the industry's made progress on responsible purchasing practices. The next slide shows what the survey covers. So suppliers are asked to respond to just 10 simple statements, which are aligned with Better Buying's 5 principles of responsible purchasing. And this is a kind of North Star to which brands and retailers should be aiming. And you can see them highlighted in the graphic on the right. So the 5 principles are visibility, stability, time, financials, and shared responsibility. So as an example, for visibility, we want to know if the buyer gives suppliers the visibility necessary to plan their business operations. So is there enough insight into future orders? Is there enough detail in forecasts? Are there regular updates on changing demand? For time, the survey asks if the buyer has enough time for all processes. For example, is there enough of a lead time? Do approvals come through on time? Are technical details or product specifications accurate and on time? And then we also look at things like the buyer's financial practices and whether or not they're fair on suppliers. For example, if the buyer asks for something, do they actually pay you for it? Are they fair around pricing, around payment, and even around honouring contracts? On the next slide, I've shown how we're trying to also increase supplier participation in the survey. It's available in multiple languages, which can be accessed via a drop-down menu in the top right-hand corner of the survey. And this year, we're also adding extra languages in response to requests from the industry we want. So we're bringing in new translations in French, Italian, and in Portuguese. The next slide shows a snapshot of the format of the survey. So you can also see how quick and easy it is for suppliers to complete. The survey is made up of just 10 statements, with the response consisting of 5 options to choose from. Each statement is what we call subjective, so it's an opinion of the customer relationship. There's no need to liaise with colleagues in a supplier company or gather information from different departments in order to be able to respond. Response options range from all of the time to never, and to calculate the overall purchasing practices scores, the answers are rated using a 5-point scale. So all of the time generates 5 points on a scale all the way down to never, which is worth only 1 point. And the responses are then classified into one of 3 categories of partnership. There's the true partner, which is the top score, collaborators and detractors. And on the next slide, I'll talk about these definitions in more detail. So we use a traffic light bar to show at a glance the percent of supplier responses that fall into the 3 options of partnership quality. So responses of all of the time to each statement put the buyer into the true partners category, which is shown in green. And according to Better Buying's definition, true partners work with their suppliers to achieve shared objectives. So they'll seek input from suppliers, and they'll also collaborate closely with their suppliers. Their use of time and resources is efficient, it's non-duplicative, and the relationship is fair in the sense that they share risk and they also have a long-term focus. Responses often belong to the collaborators category. Now, collaborators practices frequently strive for improved communications, but they don't always get there. So they're kind of seeking more collaboration, more transparency in their partnerships with suppliers. But as I say, they don't always make it. And then at the bottom of the scale, responses of sometimes, rarely, or never to each of the statements in the survey are used to calculate the detractors percentage, which is shown in red. And by our definition, detractors simply show a lack of respect for their suppliers and they work against them rather than with them. So they limit the amount of information they share with their suppliers, and they focus on achieving their own objectives and margins at the detriment of the suppliers. And these practices in turn prevent suppliers from running a sustainable, profitable business. So how did we do last year? Karen's going to talk in more detail about the findings, but this is really an overview. When we ran the survey last October, we received 519 supplier responses and 94 different buyers were rated. The highest participation was seen from suppliers headquartered in the China region. And based on these responses, the overall partnership score was 39. And this is on a possible range from -100 to +100 points. There's plenty of detail about the scoring methodology on the Better Buying website, but essentially, the more suppliers that respond all of the time to every question, the better the score will be. So a score of 100, for example, would mean that all suppliers responded all of the time to every question. If you look at the traffic light bar on the right, you'll see that 56% of buyers last year were rated true partners, 28% were seen as collaborators, and 17% were detractors. So this is where we are now. And as we move forward into the next cycle, a measure of progress will be to try to move the overall score closer to 100 and to see the green bar get bigger and the red bar get smaller. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about next steps. So for suppliers, as I keep saying, look out for the link to the questionnaire, which will be available on the 3rd of October. Participation's open to all suppliers globally. You can rate your customers whether or not they've invited you to do so. And remember, it takes just 5 minutes of your time to submit a rating for each buyer. Your feedback is completely anonymous. So really, this is your chance to make sure that your voice is heard. Help us to identify what the industry is doing well, and also those practices that need to change. Share the link with your colleagues and get them to submit a rating too. At the end of the survey, you'll be reminded to evaluate another customer if you want to, using the link. So make sure that you try to rate all of your brand partners. Next steps for brands and retailers. Again, please share the survey link with as many of your suppliers as possible. Don't just invite your strategic suppliers, but invite as many of them as you can. And reach out across all tiers of your supply chain. This can include raw materials suppliers, packaging suppliers, Basically, as long as they have a direct relationship with you and they can rate your purchasing practices, then they can actually participate in this survey. Ask your suppliers to take part. And we know from experience that an invitation from their customers makes a big difference. And just remind them again that it's quick, it's easy, and it's anonymous. The industry we want is your initiative. So help us collect the data at scale on purchasing practices worldwide. And by doing so, be part of the industry we want's new vision for the garment industry. And finally, on the next slide, why not get your own company score and report? For brands with at least 5 supplier ratings, we can provide a company report to purchase, which will show your own unique score. There'll be benchmarking and also feedback about your practices from your suppliers. You can compare your score with the industry we want, with ETI or Fairwear, and you'll also get a fuller picture on how your company is performing on each of the partnership questions. So you'll see direct feedback from your suppliers, and you'll be able to find out whether you're a detractor, whether you're a collaborator, or whether you're a true partner to your suppliers. So to sum up, I'd really like to reiterate that the message we need you to take away today is let's build on last year's survey. Let's collect as much information as we can on the industry's purchasing practices. We need as many of you as possible to participate. If you didn't join in last year, then please do so this year. And if you did take part last year, we hope you'll do it again. And with that, I'll hand back to Karen.
Thank you so much, Leonie. That was a great overview of everything that is included in the partnership index. And it's my pleasure to now go a bit deeper into what that means. So as you've heard, the purchasing practice score that you see in front of you was generated, and the next iterations of these will be generated by the Better Buying Institute's partnership index. This annual survey available for all suppliers to rate their buyers' purchasing practices on a scale from 1 to 5. Doesn't matter if you are a Fairwear brand, ETI brand, or have subscribed to Better Buying, any supplier across the world can fill out this survey. I won't go deeply into this because you've already seen the overview, but we received over 500 responses from suppliers across 50 different countries, and from a potential range from -100 to +100. The score this year for the first cycle is 39. Now, if we break this down, we can see that amongst the buyers rated, 56% of overall behaviors were considered those of true partners. 28% were those of collaborators, and 17% were those of detractors. But I do want us to emphasize and bear in mind that 75% of respondents indicated that they were rating preferred partners. So these results very much reflect the behavior of the industry's best actors. Now, breaking down the score and the feedback. If we look at the report in more detail, we can see the 6 top-rated practices across the industry run in the following order. First, we have business dealings free from corruption and bribery, with 90.8% true partners, the highest percentage of true partners of any of the categories. Then after this, we have a clear indication that suppliers are rating their preferred partners, just as I mentioned before, and this could indicate 2 things. First, that buyers are perhaps more comfortable rating their preferred partners, but also that preferred partners might be more willing to reach out to their suppliers to gather their feedback. Nevertheless, it is interesting to keep in mind that much of this feedback represents the feedback of the best actors in the industry. And perhaps we should take that consideration in mind when we look at the results. Now, beyond the absence of corruption and bribery and preferred partnerships, the 4 most highly rated behaviors were communication, financial practices, the provision of visibility necessary to business operations, and buyers doing their part to improve environmental performance and practices in the supply chain. Now you can see, however, that true partners scores also begin to descend quite rapidly to 50% line. And even amongst these 4 top categories, with detractor scores really rising to almost 20% on the matter of environmental performance. Now, if we look at the bottom 6, we can see that for each of these categories, fewer than 50% of suppliers are rating their buyers as true partners. The issues set out here are clearly of significance. We can also see that across each of these categories, the percentage of buyers behaving as distractors is really beginning to creep up. And the first findings of the index make it clear how much pressure suppliers are under, with many buyers never, rarely, or sometimes providing enough time, adequate visibility, stable business, and fair financials. So thanks to our collaboration with the Better Buying Institute, we're also fortunate to have scores for our 2 MSIs, ETI and Fairware. These scores were devised by collecting all supplier responses from ETI or Fairware member brands and aggregating them into 2 separate reports that can be compared to the industry score. And here you can see the comparison of those scores. I will go into the details of what those differences mean now. So rather than going one by one over the positive results, I want to point you to the shared top scores of the issues by both ETI and Fairware members. So fair financial practices, business dealings free from corruption and bribery, and particularly good communication practices, all scoring higher than the industry score. Now, despite the many positive aspects of these top scores, we think it's more interesting to perhaps highlight some of the bottom scores to flag the areas of improvement. It is clear, however, that being part of an MSI does result in brands having a better state of purchasing practices. Now, going deeper into the ETI score, if we look at it, we see that it is 8 points above the wider industry score, with 47 on the scale of -100 to +100. Of the overall scores for ETI brands, 63% of practices were rated of those of true partners, 20 those of collaborators, and 17 of detractors. Now, the areas of improvement, or the bottom 6 scores that we can see, are around these issues: the reduction of duplicative audit requirements, support for improved working conditions, visibility to plan business operations, efficiency, also support for improved environmental performance, and the requests for suggestions on product and process innovation. Less than 60% of ETA member brands are considered true partners. Saying that, however, we can also see that the true partner scores, again in the turquoise, are higher for ETI member brands than they are for the industry as a whole, which is shown in the dark gray. As an example, you can see that 56.5% of ETI member brands are rated as true partners on the matter of operational efficiency, compared with just the 43.7% in the industry scores. In fact, across all 6 categories, there is around an average 8% difference, by which I mean uptick, between ETI member brand true partner performance when compared to the industry score for these 6 issues. However, we can also see that there are a few areas in which the percentage of ETI member brands behaving as detractors, which is shown in the darker blue, is slightly higher than those of the industry score, which are shown in white. For example, you can see this on the issue of visibility, where 20% of ETI member brands are rated as detractors compared to the 16.8% in the wider score. Now, quickly turning to the Fairware report. The overall score is 67, which is around 28 points, which is 28 points above industry score of 39. You will see that 73% of Fairware members are rated true partners over the industry score, and just 6%, a notably lower percentage of detractors. So these top level scores really reflect well on Fairware member brands, but it is also worth noting that there were less brands that were rated. So ETIs had 85 suppliers provide feedback, while Fairware only had 35. So there we can also see that difference in composition. Now let's look at the areas of improvement for Fairware member brands. If you look at the turquoise scores indicating the percentage of Fairware brands rating their true partners for each of these behaviors, you'll see that each of them is significantly higher than the dark gray bars that indicate the industry score of these issues. And again, across all of these issues, Fairware members are scoring an average of 18% higher than the industry score. And if you compare the dark blue, the detractor category, indicating the percentage of Fairware member brands behaving as detractor, you can see that they are scoring consistently lower in this category than in the industry score. In fact, across all 6 of these categories, there's an average 14% difference between the Fairware and the industry score. And if you look, for example, at the last item, only 5.6% of Fairware member brands are rated as detractors in this category, compared to the industry score of 22.5%. Now that we've learned about the first cycle results of the purchasing practice metric, I want to shift our focus to what we actually do consider to be responsible purchasing practices and what they look like, and showcase how this initiative, the industry we want, also functions as a big tent where all those that agree on a common purpose and want to contribute to progress in the industry are invited to create work plans, share their knowledge, and foster new collaborative efforts so that we can innovate and transform this industry. And on responsible purchasing practices, we are glad to have the MSI group leading such alignment work. So I will now be handing it over to my colleague, Milena, who will be sharing more about the MSI group, but also their work on the common framework for responsible purchasing practices. Over to you, Milena.
So a recent example on aligning on the topic of today's session is indeed the common framework for responsible purchasing practices. Above all, you could say that the framework is a reference document on what constitutes responsible purchasing and can be used by companies working to improve their purchasing practices, and also for MSIs supporting their members in making these practical improvements. It brings together and aligns well-recognized principles of good purchasing practices and suggests positive practices within these principles. You can see the 5 key principles of the framework outlined here, and I encourage you to visit the website that we also just posted in the chat for more details and a deep dive into the framework. The working group, which has collaborated to draft the framework, has included the joint ETIs, Fairware, PST, and also the Dutch AGT. And as a next step, and already starting next month, the working group is kicking off the learning and implementation community, which brings together companies in a peer learning environment who want to take new steps in improving their purchasing practices. We recognize the framework does not offer off-the-shelf solutions for every business model, which is why as part of this community, we want to find out how we can make the practices of this framework also workable in practice. But really look forward to sharing the learnings as they arise out of this community more widely also via the industry we want.
Thank you all. And we really look forward to making you part of our community and helping in this journey towards more responsible purchasing practices. Quick reminder, 3rd of October until the 31st of October, this survey will be open. We will send out all of that information again via email in the follow-up, and also a recording of this session so that you can rewatch anything that you have missed out on. Thank you so much for everyone that joined today, and speak to everyone soon.